Mr. Peritz.
All right, hello everybody. And I have muted everyone. There was some background noise. And as I think you're growing familiar with, if you just hold your space bar down, you can interject a comment at any time you'd like. I'm coming to you today with a bit of a heavy heart. I need to speak with you about something serious and sad, necessary. And that is what's going on in the country right now, and in particular, the events that have prompted it. And of course, I'm referring primarily to the death of George Floyd at the hands of the Minneapolis police a week and a few days ago, and the protests, mainly peaceful, that have spilled out onto the streets of most American cities and many towns. And what it is that has motivated those protesters. And so that's what I'm going to focus on today. We are, of course, in the middle of a long lecture series on rising inequality in contemporary America. And we've already spoken together about race on several occasions, though in passing, not as a sustained topic of analysis or a sustained focus for our discussions. And today, I'm going to focus exclusively on race, and in particular on police violence and the role that it plays in sustaining the contemporary American racial order. And so it's a serious topic. It's a difficult topic. It's an important topic. And I hope you will bear with me. I'm going to take some time to introduce you to a number of aspects that I think need to be covered in order to do justice to the complexity of the topic. So I'm going to just give you a little overview of what we're going to cover together. And we're going to start with a little background. And as I imagine most of you must be aware, George Floyd was apprehended by the police in Minneapolis, Minnesota on Memorial Day, following his apparent use of a counterfeit $20 bill. He was apprehended, handcuffed, and eventually placed on the ground. And a police officer kneeled on his neck and the back of his skull and applied sufficient pressure and weight that eventually Mr. Floyd died. And this has been captured on video, widely circulated, and I will talk about that as we get further into the lecture. This is the immediate catalyst for these events, and I will talk more about it as we get into it. The events, of course, are protests, and these protests have been sustained now for over a week in Minneapolis, and for the better part of a week in New York City and many other of America's major cities. They have been largely peaceful. They've called for justice and for reform in ways that I will demonstrate. They have also been occasionally punctuated by riots and looting. But they have also been, I think, met by, in many cases, a real display of disproportionate police force. And so that has been one of the, I think, factors that has led some of these events to spiral out of control. Now, having said that, I'm going to also talk about an incident that happened in New York City. And I'll talk a little bit about Ahmaud Arbery. And you may know that Ahmaud Arbery is the African-American man who was jogging in an Atlanta suburb several months ago in February. And two white men, I guess it was actually three now, followed him, two of them in their pickup truck, confronted him and eventually shot and killed him. And as you may have seen in today's news, there is an indication that they may have also referred to him with a racist epithet at the time that they killed him. And of course, that didn't come to our attention immediately, but came to our attention very soon before the footage of George Floyd came to our attention. And then finally, one other incident. And I really think it's the conjunction of all these incidents that has led to the boiling over of outrage in our cities right now. The third incident is fortunately not nearly as tragic in its outcome. Amy Cooper, a white woman, was out walking her dog in New York City, in Central Park in particular, and took the dog off the leash. And she was confronted by an African-American man who was bird watching in the same area in Central Park. And he asked her to put the dog back on the leash. She refused. He offered the dog some treats in order to incentivize her to get the dog back on the leash. And at that point, she not only threatened to, but did in fact call the police and said that she was being harassed and threatened by an African-American man. And as we will see, I believe what Amy Cooper was doing, in fact, was mobilizing the threat of police violence in order to prevail in an otherwise petty dispute in which he was clearly in the wrong. And again, it's the conjunction of these events, right? A police killing, a vigilante killing, the mere invocation of the threat of police violence, all at the same time as the coronavirus and its racially specific events that explain something that is otherwise a little mysterious. Why now, right? Why this event? Why did this event more than others? Because these events happen nearly daily, catalyze this kind of protest. And so that's what I want to discuss with you today. In order to do that, I'm going to need to discuss America's evolving racial order, and in particular, the idea of structural racism, the role of police violence in maintaining this order, and the political implications of the protests for our election season, which of course we're in the middle of. So that's my ambitious agenda for today, and I will jump right into it. So I want to start with the signs that America's system of racial inequality is stubbornly resilient. And when I say this, I start, of course, from experiences we've all shared, which is the quite wonderful changes in American society that occurred in the 1950s and 1960s through a series of Supreme Court decisions, marches, rallies, sit-ins, boycotts, and eventually legislation, which seemed to transform the racial order of the United States away from hateful white supremacy, to really, for the first time in the history of the nation, say, are you going to live up to the creed that gave birth to this nation, the idea that all men are created equal, and took seriously the harms of racism, the dehumanization of African Americans, especially but not exclusively in the Jim Crow South. And so we've seen that racial order decline. But I want to say that we've also seen another racial order emerge in its place. And not only is it perhaps as effective in producing social inequality, but it may also be more stable. Having said that, I want to be clear, it's not as vicious, it's not as mean, it's not as hateful as Jim Crow, explicit white supremacist, hateful racism was. And it's allowed for the emergence of an African-American middle class, an African-American elite, an African-American president, right? All of that was inconceivable 50, 60 years ago. And so things have changed. But it's one thing to say that aspects of the racial order have transformed and transformed for the better. Another thing to believe as I think some people naively do, that our society no longer has a racial order. I think that's a fundamental mistake, and one I want to try to correct first with some data and then with some analysis. And so start by looking at this. And there are many places you can go to get data like this. Literally, this popped up in my Google feed yesterday from CNN. This is the black-white racial wealth disparity in America. And as you can see, white households earn, or I should say have on average 10 times the median net worth of African-American families. And this varies, it goes up and down sometimes, but rarely does it fall below 6 or 7 to 1 ratio in terms of wealth. And we'll talk more about what that means and how it's produced and what it does to people. But this is just to give you a little bit of evidence that something is going on in American society that produces systematic racial inequality. And we need to get our heads around it to understand it. First, we need to see the evidence that it exists. A second piece of evidence has to do not now with wealth, how much money you have, but income, how much you earn on an annual basis. And as you can see, Black households earn a little less than 60% of what white households earn on average. This is due to occupational segregation, due to the fact that whites typically have better educational opportunities than African Americans, due to flat out racism and discrimination in the job market as well. Next, we look at the rates of poverty. And what we see is that for African Americans, the rate of poverty is more than double that of white Americans. And please note that this is data from 2018. I can only imagine, and I've given you a little bit of information in the past to suggest that this has gotten worse in the aftermath of the coronavirus. We'll see a little bit more of that as we go along, but clearly, part of the discrepancy here is the prevalence of poverty for African Americans, many of whom live in neighborhoods of concentrated intergenerational poverty in a way that is true for far fewer whites in America. Getting more specific about the coronavirus, when we look at the number of people who lack health insurance in America. And if you remember, we talked about this at the beginning of the lecture series. We see that Blacks are almost twice as likely to lack health insurance as white Americans. And we could begin to talk about the quality of healthcare available to African Americans. The data are stark. The ambulance response time in Black neighborhoods is usually twice as long as it is in white neighborhoods. The proximity of hospitals, the quality of the hospitals. And so once we begin to drill down, there's much more going on here than just lack of health insurance. But lack of health insurance is one easy to capture metric for racial inequality in the United States. And finally, to get to the present moment, what we see is that Black people make up a larger share of COVID deaths than their proportion in the population, nearly double, right, their proportion in the population. And the data here are not very reliable, to be honest with you. I suspect this is going to look worse before all is said and done once we get better information. There have been real lapses in the way in which states have been reporting the information, in the way in which the federal government has been collating the information. But having said that, this is not something we should be surprised by, right? African Americans have, given their place in the occupational structure, done a lot of the essential labor, whether that's working at grocery stores or working in retirement communities or delivering our goods to our doors or staffing the warehouses where those goods are packaged, or working in the hospitals, right? African Americans have a history, statistically, of occupying the places in the job market that have been most exposed to the coronavirus, least capable of working from home. And so that's just a little bit of information about what's going on in our society today with regards to racial inequality. My question now is not, are we racially unequal? I think that the evidence is abundant and absolutely clear that America remains a society in which race is one of the primary determinants of social fate. The question is, how is this maintained? And how is it maintained after Brown v. Board, after the Civil Rights Act, after the Voting Rights Act, after all of the state-enforced legal racial inequality has been defeated? And my short answer is one that is not unique to me. The theory is called structural racism, and it's been set out by a whole school of scholars who've done impressive work. I'm going to call your attention for a moment to one of the books that I like most on this, but there are plenty of them. The World is a Ghetto by Howard Wynett, I think is extremely good. So is Racism Without Racists by Eduardo Bonilla Silva. Books I teach a lot when I teach these topics at college. So the question here is how structural racism works. How is this produced? And the answer is that racial inequality is now produced not by law per se, but by social structures that the law permits to operate in racially specific and discriminatory ways. And I'm sure you've seen the studies in which whites and blacks submit resumes to jobs, and they are coded, right? These are studies. This is not literally whites and blacks submitting their job applications. They're coded to make it obvious to the person who is receiving the application that one person is black, the other person is white, although other than that, they're essentially identical, right? So you use an Afrocentric name and a traditional Anglo-Saxon name to mark the fact that these people are racially different. And typically, the black resume, the black application is thrown away, never gets an interview, never gets consideration. And when you interview people about why they do this, some of this does have to do with racial stereotypes. They don't think African Americans are going to work as hard or be as honest as the white American applicant. They suspect maybe they benefited from affirmative action. But a lot of this has to do instead with the idea of fit. And this has become one of the most important criterion in hiring. Will this person fit with the other people who work here? If not, we're going to have problems. We're not going to be as productive. Well, we're all white, right? Or we are white and Asian, and we get along fine and we work together well. If we bring an African American into the mix, is that going to perhaps rock the boat, perhaps upset things? So that's one example of structural racism. I want to give a few more examples that are a bit more invisible and insidious. And so one of the things that produces this staggering gap in wealth, right? How much are people worth? How much money do they have as a family? One of the things that produces this staggering wealth gap is home ownership, differential rates of home ownership, right? And white Americans, majority of us, own our homes. African Americans' home ownership is much less frequent, and the homes that African Americans own tend to be worth a lot less than the homes that white Americans own. How does that happen? Why is that? Is this just the difference in rates of savings? And here I want to say absolutely not. One key factor is intergenerational transmission of wealth. And so most white young adults today cannot afford to buy their home on their own. They get assistance from their parents, but their parents own their homes. And so they're able to take out a second mortgage or to borrow against it, an equity line of credit, right? To assist their children in owning a home, because we know that this is the main store of wealth for most middle-class Americans. But if you're African American, the deck is stacked against you in a number of ways. And some of this has to do with a history, right? A history that's often referred to as a history of redlining. And this has to do with the practice of drawing lines on maps by the federal government, by mortgage and bank lenders, and also by insurance agencies. And these were lines that essentially said, if you live here, you can get a insured, federally backed mortgage. And if you live there, you can't, right? And one of the really good books on this is Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law. And as you can see, the cover of his book actually has one of these maps with areas shaded in red that are kind of no-go zones for bankers, mortgages, and mortgage insurance, yellow, which are more problematic, and white, which are good to go areas. And the people who drew those lines on maps did so in ways that coincided with existing patterns of racial segregation. So essentially, if you lived in an African-American area, you couldn't get a federally backed mortgage. And so I think that's right, part of the origins of these differences in wealth. In addition to that, we have steering, which is when a real estate agent has an African-American couple, let's say, come to them and say, we want to buy a house in this neighborhood. We want to buy a house in Scarsdale, New York, for instance. And the real estate agent says to them, well, actually, I've got a really good number of properties in Mount Vernon. Why don't you come with me to a wealthy but dominantly African-American community? And if the Black couple doubles down and says, well, no, we really want to live in Scarsdale. Which house were you interested in Scarsdale? This house on this road. Oh, that house already has a bid in on it. I'm sorry, but it's no longer really on the market, even though it's still listed, right? Why do real estate agents do this? And again, study after study after study shows that real estate agents do this to this day. There was recently a big expose of this occurring in Long Island. They don't do it purely out of racist or racial animus. They're not just not willing to show Blacks homes in certain areas. They do it because they recognize how to protect their bottom line. They earn their income through commissions on sales. If the value of the home is high, so is their commission. If the value of the home goes down, so does their commission. And we know that when African Americans move into dominantly white or white and Asian neighborhoods, housing values go down, right? There's this phenomenon of a tipping point. It can be 5% Black, 10% Black, 15% Black. It varies geographically, it varies with the culture of the place, but there's such a thing as a neighborhood being too Black for it to sustain its real estate values. Real estate agents don't want that, and so they don't do it. They do everything in their power to resist integrating a neighborhood, to segregate or maintain the segregation of neighborhoods. Finally, as we know in terms of, profiling, what we've seen with Bank of America and Wells Fargo, other banks as well, is that a decade ago, probably not occurring right now, but when there was a major home buying craze in the United States, these banks put out policy that said, when African Americans enter our establishment and ask about a mortgage, steer them into subprime mortgages, steer them into disadvantageous mortgages, because these are people who probably have never bought a home before, don't have a history, are not getting good advice from their parents. They're not going to know a good mortgage from a bad mortgage. They just want a mortgage. So let's profiteer on them, right? And these are all things that have undermined African American wealth that have produced this glaring discrepancy that don't have to do per se with people being explicitly racist, but at least not in the old-fashioned hateful sense, but just with drawing lines on maps or attempting to protect their bottom lines or attempting to protect their value of their home, which is the main store of their savings. Nevertheless, quietly, invisibly, but very efficiently, this mechanism produces tremendous inequality, right? Now, second factor, very quickly, of structural racism. This has to do with how patterns of residential, occupational, and school segregation instill mental maps of where groups belong geographically and socially. And here I'm drawing on the work of Ryan Enos, a contemporary scholar at Harvard University. Oh, I'm sorry, I thought I had put his picture. No, I guess I didn't put his picture in my slideshow. But Ryan Enos, I can find his book for you. Give me just a moment. Just published this book, The Space Between Us, Social Geography and Politics. And it's a wonderful, innovative, interesting study. And in it, he demonstrates, first of all, that in most of America, white and blacks, especially, Latinos and whites to a large degree also, are as or more segregated than we were 70 years ago, right? We're as segregated as we were before the Brown v. Board decision. There was some progress in integration in the 1960s, 1970s, well, depends how you look at it, but we've gone back, right, to being as segregated as we were before, not because the law says anymore that we can't live in the same neighborhoods, but because mechanisms like redlining or steering or profiling by banks or just the inequality in wealth that they generate and reinforce lead us to live in different areas. And frankly, because if you live as the only African American in a dominantly white area, then you have to send your kids to a dominantly white school. You may not feel very comfortable. They may not feel very comfortable. There's an aspect of belonging to this as well. But he documents quite clearly that we are a highly segregated society, the contemporary United States. And so he starts out by saying, well, we've become geographically segregated, right? If A's and B's are two different kinds of people, call them whites and blacks, you know, not kinds of people, but they've got a clear marker of group differentiation, like the color of our skin, our phenotype. And you sort them out. All A's live over here, all B's live over here. Well, in our minds, that begins to create categories, and those categories become salient. It becomes easier to group the people in that way. And when you see a member of that group, the first thing you think of is the category that they belong to as opposed to the individual. It comes rapidly to mind because all the B's live over there. Wait a sec, now there's one over here. What are they doing over here? They're out of place, right? So we think in terms of group categories. And when we use group categories to organize the way we think about each other, then we tend to produce distinctions of social and political space. All African Americans have these cultural attributes. They go to these kinds of schools, these kinds of churches, eat this kind of food, listen to this kind of music, play this kind of sport. And this also leads then to a sense of political division. They're going to vote for their candidates. We're going to vote for our candidates. And so this is another example of a mechanism that does not require the state to enforce segregation, separation, inequality, but still leaves us separate and segregated and unequal. Third, I'm just going to be very brief about this, is the idea of opportunity markets. And I'll talk with you at more length about this in later lectures. But if you think about what people do these days to get their kids admitted to college, right? Beginning from a very young age, they're sending them to the very best daycare centers. They're then sending them off for chess or music lessons, soccer or karate practice. They're then getting them academic tutors, especially for test prep, right? And this has been called by Annette LaRue in her great book, Unequal Childhoods, concerted cultivation, right? And what concerted cultivation allows the already wealthy to do, because this stuff is expensive, it allows them to put together the kind of resume and college application that gets them into the most highly selective colleges in the United States. The figures here are stunning. If you take the top 28 colleges in the United States, 60% of the students who attend them come from the top 1% of the wealthiest and highest earning Americans, right? And when you go to that kind of college, of course, the network that you get, the credential that you get, makes it much more likely that you're going to be able to get a great job, have high income, have high wealth yourself. And so again, here's another mechanism: differential access to education. We fund our schools locally. When those real estate agents steer the African-American parent to Mount Vernon instead of to Scarsdale, they're steering them to a school that spends less than a third per pupil than does the Scarsdale school system, right? The outcomes are going to be different. And so again, this is the way structural racism works in the United States today. It's not an accident that we have these tremendous inequalities. It's a sign of a subtle, invisible mechanism for producing racial inequality that is highly efficient and that most of us remain apathetic about, heads in the sand about, uninterested in most of the time, right? And part of the reason we're able to be so apathetic about it is that we don't see visible signs of its operation because it is so subtle, structural, instead of hateful. But that does not mean it does not exist. This is one of the ironies of the civil rights revolution that occurred in our society, is in a sense it dismantled a obvious racial order and replaced it with a nearly invisible racial order. Now I want to turn to the issue with police violence in our society and how pervasive racially specific police violence is. And I want to start with a little data for you, again, just to provide you some evidence of what I'm talking about. And so let's start. Oh, I'm sorry, again, I've got my data in the wrong order here. I produced a whole bunch of information on this and now I'm not seeing it. Give me just a moment and I can get these slides for you. I'm not quite sure where they went, but I know how to get them. Give me just one more moment. All right. So sorry for the interruption there. Like I say, something went wrong with the way my slides were organized. Um, let's start with the use of lethal violence. And as we can see, right, African Americans are killed by the police at a rate 3 times higher than white people are. On the other hand, African Americans are actually less likely to be armed than white people are when they're apprehended. And I want to say just for a minute how this works and why this is the case. And this has to do primarily with something called implicit or unconscious bias. And that starts with the fact that our culture, especially our media, circulates images of African American men as dangerous, as criminal, as violent, and that we come to have an unconscious association of African Americans as potentially dangerous. And we see this for almost everyone in our society, including African Americans, when we show them slides of Black faces as opposed to white faces, Black male faces as opposed to Black female faces. And we show those slides for just a millisecond, too brief a period for it actually to register and for you to consciously take note of it, but long enough for us to be able to measure your bodily response. What we see is that when you see the image of an African American male face, typically ages around 16 to around age 40, you have an immediate adrenaline response. Your body starts to go into a so-called fight or flight mode. And what we know is when the body does that, judgment gets clouded, right? Energy goes into preserving yourself as opposed to thinking carefully. And the result is that you're much more likely to react out of fear. You're much more likely to perceive danger. You're much more likely to react in a self-defensive or preserving way. And that's what's happening with police in these encounters. They're misperceiving the risk in the situation, overreacting, escalating it, in part because they're scared because they have unconscious racial bias. This happens, by the way, with African American police officers, in addition to happening with white police officers or Asian police officers or Latino police officers. Having said that, it doesn't happen uniformly everywhere, right? And as we can see, if you look at Oklahoma versus Georgia, which have comparable race and crime data, what you see is that you're actually much more likely to be killed by the police in Oklahoma than you are in Georgia. And we can break this down city by city as well. And what differentiates states and cities is the policies that they have put in place with their police, whether or not they've put in place policies that acknowledge unconscious bias and its effects and attempt to counteract the cascade. You can't actually undo the unconscious bias, but you can make people aware of it and force them to train to counteract it. And you can also put in place policies like mandatory de-escalation, that the police are responsible for trying to find a peaceful way out of a conflict, or a clear escalation of force policy. You can't draw your gun until you've exhausted less lethal options. These bring the level of violence down. And here are these proven solutions, right? And their effects. If you require officers to use all other means before shooting, police killings go down by 25%. And you can see, right? All use of force to be reported goes down by 25%. Strangleholds and chokeholds goes down by 22%. What I was talking about a moment ago, a use of force continuum or de-escalation reduces the rate of deaths via police violence substantially, right? And so it is the case that we know things work. And if you look at a city like Buffalo, where they have a high percentage of people of color, a high crime rate, comparable with Orlando, nevertheless, they have no police killings over a 4-year period, whereas Orlando has 13 killings over that same period, right? And so we know what we can do to counteract police violence. The problem is we haven't done it, right? And oh, I'm sorry, let me now get back into my other slideshow where the rest of my slides are. And so give me just a moment. Sorry, this will take just one more moment. I am sorry for the delay. I'm just getting the new slide open for you. There we go. Okay, sorry, but back on point here now. This is very strange. I'm sorry. I am obviously having a problem with the slides. Oh, okay. So I'm gonna probably have to, let me try this one more time. Because this is, okay, there we go. I'm sorry, it was frozen. Now we can restart this. So let me pick up. I've given you some evidence that there is systematic asymmetry in the American criminal justice system. I am sorry for the delay. And by the way, the evidence that I've given you is exclusively about the use of lethal force. It's also true for use of violence. It's also true for who gets apprehended. It's also true for who gets charged. It's also true for who gets convicted. It's also true for how long they spend in jail. I'm not going to take your time to go through the details of this, but the wonderful book by Michelle Alexander called The New Jim Crow, which is on the age of mass incarceration, documents this meticulously. In every aspect of the American criminal justice system, we have systematic racial inequality. But I'm not going to spend more time on that today, having shown you the data on the lethal force. I want to spend time on another argument because this is complicated, but I want you to understand where the rage in the streets is coming from today. And to do that, I want to focus on, I think, perhaps the most impressive African-American philosopher, maybe just the most impressive philosopher of his generation, a man named Tommy Shelby, professor of philosophy at Harvard University, the director of the W.E.B. Du Bois African-American Studies Department, and the author of a couple books, the most recent of which is called Dark Ghettos: Injustice, Dissent, and Reform. And I want to spend a minute on the argument of Shelby's dark ghettos. And his argument is essentially that if we take seriously the theories of moral philosophy that account for why we have legal and moral obligations to each other, these theories assume that we live in reasonably fair societies, societies that have, in particular, fair systems of social cooperation that give each person an equal opportunity for success, that give each person equal input into how the law they must follow is going to be formulated, that give each person equal voting rights. And Shelby argues, given what we know about the degree of racial inequality in the United States today, given what we know about the failure of our society to tackle it, and given what we know about the way in which white Americans benefit from these inequalities, we have to conclude that African Americans are often not under legal and moral obligations to follow the laws and norms of our society, that often they simply are being asked to participate in a system as if it were genuinely a system of cooperation, when in fact it's not, when in fact it's a system that is so unequal that it's better viewed as one of oppression and subordination. And so I'm just sharing that with you because I think in a sense Shelby, in philosophically rigorous and creative ways, illuminates, explicates, you might say, the intuitive understanding of many African Americans, which is that this society is rigged, this society is unfair, this society does not in fact treat them as equals, but in fact has treated them as subordinates for as long as it's existed. And despite the fact that Jim Crow and hateful racism are no longer enforced, it's still the case that society remains fundamentally, racially unequal, and that the majority of Americans are all too happy to look the other and do something about this. And that means that African Americans do not have the same duties, the moral reasons to obey the law as cooperating members as white Americans do, as people who benefited clearly from the way in which our society is organized. And so the question this analysis raises, and I want to be clear here now, I'm providing some arguments that he not provide, is how then African American compliance secured. And here I want to suggest that what our society does really is to maintain the acquiescence of African Americans much more compliance than the obligation, than the duty. And the way in which is in part with the threat of police violence lurking in the background. If Americans are too assertive in demanding their rights, in voicing their claims, in standing up for their equality and dignity as fellow citizens. And that this is in with the awful image of George Floyd having the life squeezed out of him shows us. Shared this image with you. I imagine most of you got to look at it for a minute as it is to understand what this image captures. And I want to suggest that this image is really a map of power relations in America. This is Mr. Floyd on the ground, handcuffed, thrown to the ground with a police officer kneeling on his neck and skull. And as we know, that police officer kneeled there for 8 minutes, kneeled there as George Floyd lost consciousness, as he said, "I can't breathe," as he pled for his life. And this police officer was indifferent. I don't think I see hate on his face. I don't think I see fear. This is not the typical example of unconscious bias. This is something else going on. And I will take us off this image now because it is an awful image. What I think clear power map of is dominance and subordination, right? The police officer is asserting I'm in a dominant position. He's literally Mr. Floyd down. He's literally looking down at him. He is callously ignoring his pleas and the pleas of many witnesses around him to stop because he has the power and George Floyd lacks the power. This is re-establishing relationships of dominance and subordination. And in a sense, that's what police does in our society. And when we combine the recording of Amy Cooper, this is what we see so clearly, because what is Amy Cooper doing, right? When she's walking through Central Park with her dog off the leash and an African-American man confronts her, politely asks her to put the dog back on the leash, she says, no. And not only that, but if you don't let me call the police and I'm going to tell them I'm being threatened by an African-American. She is mobilizing the threat of police violence in order to assert a right that she doesn't have. The right to incivility, the right to superiority, the right to disobey the regulations of Central Park, right? She's saying, I'm not going to do it. And if you ask me to do it, I'm going to try to involve because I know when the police are called, there's a significant likelihood that your life or limb will be put at risk because of the way they react to African-American men, right? So she's mobilizing the threat of police violence in order to maintain her superior position, in order to intimidate an African-American man. And I want to suggest to you that this is why there's so much outrage in our streets today, because in a sense, you combine what happened with George Floyd and what happened with Amy Cooper and the data I've shared with you about inequality, and you see in a way that you don't normally see how it is that police violence is maintaining racial inequality in the United States today. I want to conclude by comparing the image I just shared with you. I'm not going to share it with you again. It's awful, and I don't want to dwell on it. But that image with an image that I suspect many of you may also be familiar with, which is the image of Elizabeth Eckford entering Central High in Little Rock, Arkansas in September of 1957, right? This is the little black girl wearing sunglasses, throng of white children with hate etched on their face, malice and obvious epithets being flung at her, and she's walking calmly into the school building. And I want to suggest, as others have, that in a sense, that image and images like it, of Emmett Till in his open casket, of the Birmingham police sicking dogs and firing water cannons at the children during the Children's Crusade in the summer of 1963, that these images did as much to secure the success of the civil rights movement as did the soaring rhetoric of Martin Luther King's speeches or the leadership of Lyndon Baines Johnson in passing important legislation. That these images, in a sense, laid bare for America and the world to see the power relations of the Jim Crow racial order, the tremendous hate that had to be inculcated and mobilized to maintain it, and the simple dignity of the people who were asserting their equal rights despite the racial intimidation they faced. And that, in a sense, the image that we just saw of George Floyd may become the iconography image, the iconography of the current civil rights movement, of the Black Lives Matter movement, but of what I can only hope will be a more sustained movement to finally address the 21st century form of racial inequality and racial hierarchy in the United States. And that is what we're seeing pouring forth into our streets, is people saying, look, you've got to look at this. You've got to see it, and you've got to understand the way racial inequality operates now. It operates through police violence, and that has to stop. But it also operates through police violence used to intimidate African Americans from demanding that white Americans pay attention to and finally do something about the racial order of our society. And as disruptive and dangerous as these protests are, dangerous not only because of the police response, but also because of the coronavirus and the fact that people are coming together in close proximity with each other and being forced together by the police. As dangerous as they are equally necessary. Our society doesn't change through politics as usual. It doesn't change, certainly, when fundamental privileges rooted in deep structural inequalities are at stake. It only changes when considerable pressure is brought to bear. And I'll just note one more aspect of this, and that has to do, again, with the coronavirus and the fact that African Americans have borne a disproportionate share of helping our nation to get through the coronavirus crisis, and have, as a result, brought home to their community the virus in large share and suffered disproportionately infection and mortality as a result. In light of that experience, they are standing up and saying, having sacrificed again for this country, we need to be treated fairly and equally by this country. I don't think we can ask them to stand down, as dangerous as it is, unless we are willing to do our part in supporting legislation, policy change at the local and state level. It's not going to happen at the national level right now. In the institutions that we work in and that we have special power in, unless and until we make real and concrete efforts to change the racial order of American society, we are not in a position to ask these people to stop their protesting. All right, I will stop there, and I am going to unmute everybody. I am happy to take whatever questions you have. Again, apologies about what happened with the slides. I thought I had everything set up, but obviously things didn't go as I intended. Who wants to start us out with a question? Please note I've unmuted you, so whoever wants to can now speak, but whatever you say will be heard, including background noise. Who wants to start us out? I'm not hearing any questions. I imagine there must be some. Are you able to speak, Anne, for instance? Can you say something just so I know that you're hearing me and I can hear you? There. All right, so I know that you're hearing me. Who wants to start us out with a question? Is the information that I shared with you today new, or is it material you were already familiar with? Fran, I see you smiling at me. Do you have a comment? Oh, I can't hear you, Fran. Hold on.
It's Lois.
Oh, hi, Lois. Go ahead. Fran was trying to talk, but I wasn't able to hear her. You go ahead, Lois, for now, and we'll try to get Fran back.
Okay. What I was trying to say was that we have been hearing all this stuff and all this problem and everything for so many days now, watching protests, watching fighting, watching destruction from everywhere, that it's kind of like not falling on deaf ears. It's like more, it's not getting me all excited to come up with questions, because I've just heard so much of this now that I am tired of it. I've worn out from it's not a criticism of you, but it's the way I feel about what's going on in this world, and how I don't feel I could even respond to it anymore.
Yeah, and I hear you. It is exhausting, and one of the reasons it's exhausting is that many of us remember struggles like this from the heyday of the civil rights movement, and we thought we came through this, and we thought we had done what we needed to do, and lo and behold, 60, 70 years later, it's happening again, right? And so there's that, and then there's this sheer exhaustion of living in a 24/7 news environment, right? And sometimes I refer to this as drinking from the fire hose, right? You know, you're going to drown. There's so much information overload coming at you all the time. So I understand all of that, and I appreciate what you say, which is that it doesn't mean that it's not relevant and important and urgent. It just also means that it's exhausting. But I would encourage you to think about it for a moment from the point of view of people who live in areas where there's disproportionate policing and use of violence. Imagine how worn down and exhausted they are, right? The people who have to worry about the safety of the schools they send their children to, or have to warn their boys as they come of age, you're likely to be subject to police scrutiny when you shop or when you jog, et cetera, right? And so I'm sure we're all exhausted by this, but it's not going to go away until we do something about it, right? And then there are things we can do. And so I guess I'm in part encouraged by the fact that at the municipal level, at the state level, right, Virginia is taking down Civil War monuments. Minneapolis is changing its policing practices. All over the country, people are saying, we got to do something. Enough is enough. And by the way, these protesters have a certain amount of leverage, because they're not just disrupting life in these cities, which was already disrupted by the virus. If they respread the virus, the whole economy of these cities will be disrupted. And that's a kind of leverage you don't get very often. Thank you for the honest commentary, Lois. Fran, I know you were trying to talk. I'm trying to see, it looks to me
well,
like,
can you hear me?
Yes, yay, I can now. Go ahead, please.
All right. I have one comment, and that is, I noticed that most of the police departments across the country have tried to integrate Black officers into their, into their groups. And I'm wondering how that equates in all of this. Are they accepted? Are they scorned?
So I think two things to note here, right? The first is that many municipal police departments have become much more diverse, right? And so that's important. I think the second thing to note is that the presence of women on police forces is also extremely important. And it's interesting because women are in many ways more vulnerable to being physically overpowered, but more likely to de-escalate a situation. So these two things are important, but they're not enough, right? Racial and gender integration of police departments are important, but not sufficient to address this. And the issue here is that women and blacks do also experience unconscious bias. And so the same thing that whites feel. And frankly, that police forces tend to have internal cultures, and those internal cultures tend to have an us versus them mentality, where the cops are on the right side and the crooks are on the wrong side, and the crooks all live in certain areas and tend to have a racial profile to them. And so even a black cop often can fear and dehumanize another African American when he suspects they're a criminal and that they're going to put his life at risk. So it's not enough to diversify the police force. You need policies. Among those policies, I think one that I think is really important and not getting enough attention is community-based policing. So once you integrate the police force, once you make it more diverse, once you bring women into the police force, what kind of relationship does it have with the community? And it's not going to have a good relationship with the community if the cops sit in their cars and only come into the neighborhood when they want to arrest someone. If they come into the neighborhood, as we're seeing a lot today, this week, in a highly militarized fashion, wearing riot gear and batons and with tasers out, spraying pepper spray and tear gas. That's not going to make for good police community relations. You need the police to get out of their cars, to get down on the streets, to get to know the people in the neighborhood, to begin to treat them as people and individuals as opposed to as criminals or suspects or monsters, right? And so that is part of the dynamic here. It's not, it is important to diversify the police force. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient unless the police force has the right training, has the right policies as well. Thank you, and I'm glad we were able to get you online.
May I
Yes,
say
please.
something?
Of course. Go ahead, Harriet.
Okay. We are born, most of us are born in a prejudiced society. Hello?
I'm here. I hear you. Yeah.
Oh, and so I haven't really thought this through, and it may sound kind of silly, but perhaps we could have, where's your picture? It's gone again. Oh, damn.
Sorry, don't worry about it. But I can still hear you and see you, Harriet.
Oh, okay. Perhaps we should start maybe in the second grade in educating children about, I don't know, being anti-prejudiced. And I mean, this should go all through college, perhaps. So it's just an idea. We are all born in this society of prejudice. Our parents, who are wonderful, they were born in it also. So that's about it. I mean, I don't know what else to say about this, except that we need to be educated from being a child as you grow up, first grade, second grade, being educated against prejudice. I don't know how else to say this.
No, it's a good point, Harriet, and I think it's a really important point. And again, what I want to say is that there are different kinds of education, and they succeed more or less well depending upon how they're structured. And so if you're in a basically segregated school, and by the way, the average white child today attends a school that is 80 to 90% black. The average black child attends a school that's more than 90% black. So if this is all just in your civics lesson, if this is all just in a book, if you continue to live in a milieu, a culture, a neighborhood that is all white, it doesn't do a lot to break down those stereotypes. And I was showing you that work by Ryan Enos. If we live separately, we create separate social psychological categories. They have higher salience or relevance to us, right? And so it's not enough to engage in anti-bias training. You've got to do that, right? But in addition to doing that, you need to integrate your schools. You need to integrate your neighborhoods. You need to bring people together. And that can't be, as Tommy Shelby points out, exclusively about the black people going and living in white neighborhoods. It has to be a two-way street. And it has to be one that leaves black neighborhoods and Black cultural institutions intact, but brings kids together. So we've got to be deliberate, intentional, careful, intelligent about how we integrate our schools so that we don't.
But you already had busing and that didn't work.
Yeah, no, we need zoning. We need to build affordable housing. There's a wonderful study of Mount Laurel, New Jersey, where basically after 20 years of fighting it, the town eventually agreed to build affordable housing and brought African Americans in out of Trenton, New Jersey. And it worked incredibly well to create opportunity. And so you're absolutely right, Fran. It's, you know, busing is difficult. I wouldn't say it's been tried and failed. I would say that it's hard. It needs to be done intelligently. It needs to be done smartly, right? But in addition to that, we need to work on the segregation of our neighborhoods in order to work on the segregation of our schools, right? And so, yes, the more than busing is required. If you're only doing busing and you maintain the patterns of segregation, it's not going to be sufficient. So we need education, we need desegregation, we need desegregation not just of schools, but of at the residential level. We need policies that are really committed to the idea that racial hierarchy needs to give way. The first place this has to happen is with police violence. But my suggestion to you is that that's the tip of the iceberg, because that's maintaining inequality in other places in our society.
But many of the marchers were young people.
Young
adults. I mean, you're what do you call them? The millennials.
Yes. And interestingly diverse, right? A lot of white people, not just African Americans.
Right. Exactly.
And so again, I think I take some hope, some encouragement from that.
Well, we'll see.
And we will see, right? We've got an election 5 months from now. We've got a president who's doing everything in his power to try to use this to distract from the way in which he reacted to the virus, the incompetence and the lapses in that reaction. So yes, there's a lot at play here. But I come back to this idea, when you have the level of inequality, when you have the sustained pattern of injustice in the criminal justice system, you can't ask these people to stand down. You've got to say, you do what you need to do, and we'll join you in the ways that we can, not necessarily by going out in the streets, but by talking to our representatives at the local level, at the state level, by supporting you, by giving our backing to the kinds of policies that would make this better.
Amen.
All right, everyone. Go, Fran, did you want to say anything more? Go ahead.
No, I think you said most of it.
All right, everyone. Well, good conversation today again. I haven't heard for sure from Susan, but I think I'm going to be speaking with you again early next week. But we'll work that out. All right, everybody. Have a good afternoon. Take care. Talk to you soon. Okay.
Wash your hands.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.